Tanther Dish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah May. When it comes to wine, I have a tendency to retreat and panic. I don't know anything about it, and I certainly don't feel like I have the means to access the knowledge. And I often wonder if that's a common experience for people based on the connotations that come with wine and its consumption. I often wonder if that's a common experience for people based on the connotations that come with its consumption. My guest this week, Sarah May Grunwald, is someone that I find quite admirable for the barriers that she breaks down in communication about wine and the practice of winemaking itself. Today, she's on the show to discuss the rich, deep, and fascinating history of Georgian wines. Despite more attention being given to Italian or French traditions of wine, Sarah May taught me that wine's birthplace is long considered to be Georgia during the Neolithic period. What makes us skip over this key piece of wine history? We explore the role of the qvervi vessel in the specific practices of winemaking in Georgia, the sociopolitical and geographic influences that have informed how and where Georgian wine is made, and delve a bit into the future of winemaking with climate change as well. Here's my conversation with Sarah May Grunwald. Welcome to the show, Sarah May. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so looking forward to this chat. And before we kind of dig into the topic that we're exploring today, do you mind sharing with folks who you are, where you're coming in from, and a snapshot of the type of work that you do?
So my name is Sarah May Grunwald. I'm originally from California. I live in Italy, so I know we're going to be talking about Georgia today, and I'll kind of get to how I got to Georgia. But I actually live in Italy. So I left California in 2005, and I just decided to stay in Italy. I'm married to an Italian here, so that's how I ended up here. So almost 20 years now. So I kind of was interested in wine before coming to Italy. For example, I had done my study abroad in South Australia. So let's say at the age of 20, a lot of my friends that I was hanging out with there were in doing degrees in hospitality. There were a couple that were studying to be sommeliers. So I think I kind of got introduced to the concept of finer wine, which I don't even know if I believe in that anymore. Bottled wine, not just drinking Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill, just not drinking for the sake of drinking, but drinking wine with food, the culture of wine. So I went to my first wineries when I was there. So that kind of is where my interest in wine started. And then I went back to California. I think I was still too young to actually buy wine. I'd have to think about it because, we don't drink it. We're not allowed to buy wine or alcohol until we're 21.
Right.
Then I moved to Italy, and I just was very interested in wine culture, obviously the food, but just the culture of wine and how Italians respond to that culture of wine and how important it is on their table. So in about 2008, I started studying wine, between 2008 and 2009, I did my sommelier certification here. And so I just started reading loads and loads of books. I mean, that was my favorite topic. So I came across a book in, I think, 2010 by Alice Faring. You guys should definitely read her Substack. She's on Substack. Anyway, her first book was called The Battle for Love and Wine. And I read that book and it completely changed my life because she was the person that introduced me to the concept of natural wines. And kind of made me understood that what we are drinking typically is not natural. In the fact that there are so many chemical inputs in wine, so in agriculture, but also in cellar, right? And those are not on the ingredients list. I mean, the only thing they really have to put on a bottle of wine is the alcohol and if it contains sulfites. But it doesn't have to tell you that they've added 50 different chemicals, or what kind of chemicals were used in the agriculture. So it kind of made me think about things like yeast. Natural wines are made with spontaneous yeast, spontaneous fermentation. And most wineries use inoculated yeast so they can get the flavors that they want. It was just it was a really big epiphany for me reading this book. And it was the first time I had kind of heard about Georgian wines. I think she started going to Georgia around that time, 2010, maybe 2012. I became a reader of her blog, which used to be online rather than on Substack. And so I kind of started learning more about the overall world of natural wines through her. And then I started learning about Georgian wines. So I became very, very interested in this culture. And the fact that as a wine person, as a wine lover even, not just a person that works in wine, how important Georgia is to this culture, right? It's the birthplace of wine. So I started teaching a course for university students called Wines of Italy. And one of my classes was wine history. So I was like talking about Georgian wine, Armenian wine, etc., the history of it, but I had never been there. I had never tasted these wines. In 2012, I went to a wine conference. It was the European Wine Bloggers Conference. It was in Turkey. And the theme of that conference was wine roots, as in the roots of wine. And that was the first time I had actually gotten an opportunity to taste Georgian wines, because they had a master class at the end where we tasted wines from Turkey, Armenia, and some from Georgia. And I honestly just didn't have a vocabulary for them. I didn't go to Georgia then. They had a trip, but I didn't make it on time to sign up for it. But my friends went, and I just was fascinated. So in 2014, I went to a wine conference for wine tourism, the International Wine Tourism Conference. It was hosted by Georgia in Tbilisi. So I spoke at that conference about the importance of wine being a cultural ambassador for a region. So I only talked about Lazio wines, but after that, I was able to kind of travel around the country for about 10 days. It was honestly the most amazing wine trip I'd ever been on. And I go to a lot of wineries and I go to a lot of wine countries, but it just really was impressive for me visiting winemakers, but also, for example, going to not the wine museum, Georgian National Museum in Tbilisi. They have a whole section on wine history, and just seeing a wine vessel that was from 6000 BCE was really fascinating for me. And just seeing how people there are so connected to wine. I mean, it's really an important part of everyday culture. It's not just like Georgian culture and wine culture. They're not two separate things. They're basically the same thing in Georgia. Their level of hospitality was amazing. So at that time, I was still teaching. And I've been working in wine and food tourism in Rome since about 2007, 2008. So I just decided to start bringing people to Georgia for wine and food tours. So I also now own a company called Taste Georgia with 2 Georgian partners. So we've been in business since 2014. And yeah, I try to go to Georgia as much as I can.
I love that you shared like the full kind of history of how you got there as well, because I think particularly in wine, the stories, at least I'm not as well versed or familiar with wine. The stories that I hear tend to be circulating around particular regions that are more popular, more well known. So, California or France or Italy. And I think something that really struck me when we first started discussing this is what you were speaking to about the very long history going back almost like all the way to the Neolithic. As an archaeologist, that immediately like piqued an interest as well. But I'm curious if you can speak to how Georgians trace their culture back through wine to that early time period as well.
Well, I think the most important way they are able to link their themselves back to the Neolithic period is through their special wine vessel called qvervi. So I have one here that I made. It's not for use, but to give you an idea of what one would look like, but at a larger scale. I made this in ceramic glass. I'll bring it out when I talk a little bit more about, but that is really the one thing that kind of links people today to wine culture from 6,000 BC, because it's been in continuous use since then. And there's still qvervi makers in Georgia. So I would say it's an actual thing, an actual item that links people back. But, it's also entwined in other parts of the culture. So, for example, when Georgia was Christianized by Saint Nina, she came through Turkey. So if you ever see a Georgian cross, for example, God, I wish I had a picture of one. It's like they have a line up and then a line going like that. So it looks like the points that go out, they're not straight across, they point down. And it's supposed to be two grapevines tied with the saint's hair. So,
Wow.
I mean, you have that link through to the Orthodox Church through the vine. I mean, when you go to a lot of these old churches, you see grapevines as motifs on the churches. I mean, as I'm sure you know, in Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity, as well as Catholic and other Protestant Christian groups, wine is the blood of Christ. It's the blood of the God. So there's that link. And I've also been told, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to kind of see what Georgian script looks like. I mean, it would be backwards if I showed you anything. I've been told that even though the script is based on how grapevines grow.
Wow.
Even when you just meet random people on the street, like everybody is somehow involved in wine, right? Like in Italy, it's kind of the same, but not to that level. It's definitely not to that level. Or any other wine country I've been to. It's not at that level. I mean, people will make wine in their garages or in their apartments, even if it's just 5 liters. So I would say that there is no separation from wine culture to Georgian culture. It's like they're married.
Yeah, I think it makes me think too, what you were saying about Georgian script. I work with like a lot of Indigenous nations in Canada, and there's always a message across nations about the power of language and connecting to land and being able to use traditional languages in order to maintain those relationships with land. So it's striking that even the way that the script visually looks is tied to their relationship to grapevines as well.
Yeah, and like when I just was at this conference in Armenia, and there were a lot of Georgians there because it was very easy for them to arrive. And I swear that every Georgian woman there, like they had at least one piece of jewelry that had something to do with wine, like maybe grape earrings or a qvervi necklace, charm, everybody. So I mean, and these are, of course, wine people, but it's just so common. Like you can go into a cafe and they'll be selling little pins that say, like, I love Georgian wine. I mean, it's really incredible to me how important it is. Also in the art, in the poetry, in the literature, medicine, it's fascinating to me. And it's really fascinating to me as a wine drinker who's not Georgian and a wine lover who's not Georgian is I can have a direct link with people from the Neolithic just by consuming wines made in this traditional way. Not that they're using vessels that are that old,
right?
But still it's a tradition that's continuous, that's been handed down from father to son for thousands of years. And that is really special to me. And it's important. And I'm really glad that despite all of the times Georgia has been invaded or been, controlled by other countries, their wine culture never died. So it was able to survive invasions, Turkish invasions, Persian invasions, Russian invasions, Soviet, etc. And that's on Georgian people.
Yeah.
For making sure that happens.
Yeah, 100%. And I wanted to go back to the qvervi itself as a vessel in terms of how it's used to make wine and how that might vary compared to vessels in other regions of, even of Europe. What is it about the qvervi that makes Georgian wine, the signatures that it is today?
Well, there's a lot of, I don't want to say a lot. I don't know why I just said that. There are different terracotta vessels. Okay, throughout Europe, terracotta has been used for wine production, wine storage, wine transport since wine has been made. So I just want to emphasize that a qvervi is not an amphora. So it's not related to an amphora. Oftentimes you'll see, in articles, it's like a Georgian amphora. Amphora are Greek and they were used for transportation and they even had handles on them. For example, the Romans used something called a dolium. It's a really big kind of jar and it's flat bottomed. They were kind of buried partially in the ground. The Georgian qvervi, first of all, they're not uniform, right? So there's different kind of qvervi depending on where it's made. So right now there's only 8 producers. So let's say 8 men and maybe their sons that are making them. There's no women in qvervi production as of now. That might be changing, I hope. But it's definitely something that people start learning as children. So the clay, the type of clay, like where they source the clay will have different types of minerals. That's going to impact the wine. How big they are. They can be anywhere from 15 liters to 3,000 liters. But from what winemakers have told me, the kind of perfect spot is about 1,000 liters. Also, they're buried underground. So this is very, very important. They're not going to be moving around. You can't, once they're buried in the ground, you're not moving them. So they have to be transported from, wherever they're made to the winery. Really, depending on the region, they might be buried totally under and then covered up with dirt. I've seen winemakers that have them partially up, like the lip is up. So it really depends on the region and the preferences of the winemaker, but they're always buried. So what is the benefit of that? I would say the most important benefit is temperature control. You get a very consistent temperature control throughout the year. So it's perfect for fermentation. If your fermentation is too cold, it will just stop fermenting. If it's too hot, it'll go too fast and you won't get the complexity you want in wine. But also it's perfect for wine storage. So some winemakers, and it really depends on if they're making amber wines or red wines, they'll often close the qvervi after fermentation and they leave the marc and the stems inside the vessel. Now, because of the shape, there's a lot of energy that is taking place inside the qvervi. So you almost have like a perfect filtration system when you leave the marc. So that's like the skins and the pulp and everything, as well as the stems, because they fall down at the bottom of the conical part in a correct order. So it's filtering or like finding the wine as it sinks to the bottom. So gravity kind of helps. So these wines come out perfectly clear, even though they've been left with the seeds and the stems and the skins, because they've been filtered because of the type of kind of vortex that's created inside the vessel. So that's really fascinating to me. I think temperature control is probably the most important thing, though. But then, some winemakers will have problems with hygiene. You have to get inside the vessel to clean it. So that can be an issue.
Right. Is that something that happens more, I guess, like in terms of the cleaning piece to it? Does that kind of happen across multiple vessels in the same place, or do you see that kind of happening to one within a batch that's being made at that time?
Well, they have to clean it after every use, right? So let's say after they've bottled the wine from one, they have to clean that. So they have tools for that. There's actually people that's their skill is cleaning them. Some people just use sulfur. They use sulfur candles to disinfect them. Another thing that's interesting about it, though, is most of them are lined with beeswax, and beeswax is a natural disinfectant.
Yes. Okay.
And typically they don't really need to be re-beeswaxed for many years if they're done correctly.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I'm curious, thinking about the vessel itself, that's something that you spoke a little bit to earlier, and I'd like to explore it in more detail with you. But with the qvervi, obviously it's a really unique and specific Georgian tool to making wine. But as you kind of spoke to, the cultural values are shaped around that as well. So can you share, how these vessels transcend into broader Georgian culture as well?
It's an interesting question. I have to kind of think about it. I just want to say it just is, but that's a really stupid way to
No, no.
answer it. From what I've been told by Georgians. I mean, like, so let me just kind of backtrack here. When you go visiting wineries in Georgia, compared to, let's say, Italy, when you visit wineries in Italy, they always take you to vineyards. So really, like, what they want to show off are their vineyards. And when you're in Georgia, you might spend a little bit of time in the vineyards, but what they really want to show you is their Marani. So the Marani is like their winery. So where the qvervi are buried, that's the Marani. And, they'll talk about for an hour, 2 hours about the provenance of the qvervi, how is important to them, that it reminds them of their grandfathers because it's how their grandfathers made wine. And it's also, as I said, this link back to history. So it's a way, I think, for Georgian winemakers to kind of express their cultural identity by making wine that way. It's not that all wines are made that way. They make wines in the European way. Only about 2 to 3% of Georgian wines are made in this way. But they have this whole culture around it. Like, for example, when they open them, usually in the spring, April or May, it's a ceremony. It's very important to them. It's almost like a birth of the wine, right?
Mm.
And also, we're talking about a vessel that's made from the earth, right? It's terracotta. It's made from clay. And so it's kind of this idea that there's this repeat of what's going on in the vineyard. It's also happening inside the vessel. And I think it's kind of bigger than just winemaking, right? It's like giving birth to something.
Yeah.
And the final product is wine. In fact, one of my good friends who's a winemaker there, his name is Eko Glonti from Lagvinari Winery. He has always told me that Georgians don't say, I make wine. I help give birth, right? So qvervi can make the wine on its own. It's just we need to kind of put the grapes in and kind of help it along. It's almost like being a doctor, right? You're not the one that's giving birth, but you're helping a woman along to give birth to this wine. So I think it's really interesting the type of language that they use when they're talking about these kinds of wines as well, like giving birth to wine. Also, I've been told that it's in the shape of a woman's uterus.
Right. Yeah.
So I find that fascinating. Obviously, I can't get into the minds of Neolithic people, but it would not surprise me if they had that knowledge, because we do know that people have always had some sort of connection with the earth through women's bodies, right?
Yeah.
Earth is always
Yeah.
in the woman. So I just find that also very fascinating, that there's kind of this link to our bodies. It's like the macrocosm, the microcosm, it's all kind of taking place via this one terracotta vessel. So it's very complex as well as being simple. I mean, it's just a terracotta clay ceramic vessel, right? It seems simple, but it's also very complex.
Yeah. And it's, I think I really appreciate the nuance that you bring to that response because, as you said, you can look at the vessel and see it for what it is, but then it also holds all of these stories, this tradition, this history through, once you kind of break it down piece by piece as well. And, you spoke to the idea of being related to the earth and even the vessels being put into the ground. Can you speak a little bit to, the geography of Georgia and maybe perhaps like if there's different regional variations as well in terms of their relationship with the grapevine? Because I think about, we talk about the idea of terroir here on the show in other regions as well, but particularly given that this is the birthplace of wine, what is it about this region that allowed this relationship to proliferate between like human and grapevine to such a rich extent?
The most important wine region is a region called Kakheti. So that's in western Georgia and it borders with Azerbaijan. It's very beautiful because you can see the backdrop of this wine country is just these very dramatic mountains. And I actually wrote a bunch of notes on different soils and stuff because like my strong suit for sure. I mean, I would say the first thing we need to talk about Georgia is the fact that it's mountainous, right? It's right in the heart of the Caucasus Mountains. So that's going to be very important. What the mountains actually do is protect them from those really cold winds that could come from the north. So, oftentimes when I meet people, I say, oh, I work with Georgian wines, or I take people on Georgian wine tours. First, they don't have any idea that I'm not talking about Georgia, the state.
Right.
Georgia is a country. And oftentimes, because Georgia was in fact a part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, people just assume it's like Siberia, but it's not. It
Mhm.
has besides being in, higher elevations in the mountains, it's a very temperate climate generally. But there are different subregions, right? So Kakheti, which is in the west, is the most important wine area or wine region in Georgia, making up about 65% of the wines. That area has like alluvial soils, a lot of clay soils, and most of the vineyards are between 200 and 700 meters of altitude. So the wines there are different than, let's say, Amaretti. In Kakheti, they have their own grape varieties. So probably the two most important are Cassitelli and Saperavi. So one is a white wine or a white grape, and one is red. So those are probably the two most important. The traditional Kahetian method for winemaking is using all of the marc and leaving it in contact with the wine for an extended amount of times. I mean, I've seen wines up to 7 or 8 months in contact. So you get these very rich, richly colored wines. They're very strong. There's a lot of tannin. The descriptors I would use are nothing like I would ever use from words I learned in sommelier school or WSET. What wine education is very Eurocentric, and that's a totally different subject. But, I kind of had to ignore my wine vocabulary when I started getting into Georgian wines because they're just different. So they tend to have very hot summers and cold winters. It's a very continental climate. So that's going to make a difference. When you have very hot climate, you tend to have more alcohol. So they're strong wines. They're not my preferred wines. But of course, I think wine is important in context, right? So they have their own kitchen in that region. So the wines and the foods actually make a lot of sense together. But if I'm sitting here in Italy and I'm just making like a tomato sauce for my pasta, it doesn't make any sense. But they are actually really food-friendly wines. So that's I probably said Western. It's in Eastern Georgia near Azerbaijan. Then we would come to central Georgia, which is Kartli. This has always been a really important area for white wine making and sparkling wines. And it was known as Iberia to ancient Greeks. I'm just bringing that up because I'm sure you probably knew that. But sometimes I'll be reading something about Georgia and I'm like, they don't mean Iberian Peninsula. They mean Georgia.
I actually didn't know. I had no idea. I've heard the phrase used in past texts, but I've never connected that to Georgia. So that's really fascinating as well.
So I'm very interested to learn why Iberian Peninsula is called Iberian Peninsula. I don't know. It would be very interesting if there's any kind of connection. But the Greeks knew about these people and were probably drinking their wines as well. So Kartli is quite dry. And actually, a few of the winemakers there are having a lot of problems because of climate change, because even when it does rain, it's not long enough to be absorbed into the soil. So a lot of winemakers are having to turn to irrigation. So most of their vineyards are at about 400 to 500 meters. The Atani Gorge is the most important area. So their types of soils are, they have a lot of clay, calcareous soils. I've kind of seen a mix-up with winemakers there for how long they do skin contact. But generally, the wines from this area have a very nice acidity. So that kind of makes sense for when we're talking about sparkling wines, because you want acidity in sparkling wines. But a lot of clay, a lot of silt. I was just talking about Kartli. So I'm just bringing up 3 regions, but there's actually many more. But these are the 3 wine regions where you would probably find their wines in North America. The third one is Emireti, which is in Western Georgia. So the Greeks would have known it as Kolkis. This area, in terms of mythology, was known for Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, which was in the Caucasus. Yes. Also, who is the Greek mythology who took the fire and gave it to humans?
Oh, Prometheus?
Yes. Was apparently, his imprisonment was in the Caucasus Mountains.
No kidding. Wow.
So that's kind of a part of Greek mythology. I personally love the wines from this area. They're very fresh, very acidic. They do a lot less skin contact generally. So even when they do it, they don't use like 100%. Like they don't put everything in the qvervi. It might be 40% and for a limited amount of time. Sometimes it's just the skins without the stalks. So these wines tend to be a lot lighter. They have very mild winters and hot summers. They have a lot of sand and clay in the soil and also limestone. So great varieties there would be Tolikori, Sitska, Krakuna, Otskonori Saperi is a red wine variety. And I think these are the most food-friendly wines in the world from Emirati when they're made in the traditional way. Also, I think they're the easiest wines, especially for like wine lovers who love like Italian and French wines. I think wines from Emirati are a good transitional wine, good introductory wine, because they're not too like, big like the Kahatin wines. Wow. So I think that they're a good introductory wine for Georgian wines.
That's helpful to have that kind of pathway, particularly like I know for me, wine is something that I'm always so deeply fascinated by, but it's daunting to kind of get through into that deeper knowledge because it feels like it's this very sophisticated world that I certainly did not grow up in. And I know that's something that you do such a fantastic job through your work doing is kind of like laying these foundations. I'm curious through your work within Georgia with Georgians, you speak to like just all these regional diversities, all these different variations of wine that have arisen through time. And I wonder from your perspective, just knowing that there was like that period where there was like a Soviet occupation and that was something that you've written about where you described it as like a very industrialized, homogenized period. Mm-hmm. Do you think that these like histories of Georgian wine contributed to the persistence of like Georgian identities, Georgian heritage to get through those periods as well?
Well, number one, let's talk about the fact that Stalin was Georgian. So he would have been very familiar with the fact that Georgia was a wine country. I think that's important in this story of Sovietism across the region. For example, I mean, if we talk about wine history, we can say definitively that the oldest known winemaking is in Georgia, but just across the border is the oldest known winemaking facility, and that's in Armenia. But why don't we talk about Armenia? And it really has to do with the fact that Georgia has been allowed to have a continuous winemaking culture, and Armenia didn't, right? Armenia was relegated to brandy making during the Soviet period, whereas Georgia was allowed to continue. Even though these were industrialized and factory-made wines, they were still making wine. So the Soviet period went through a period where they wanted to have high yields. I mean, just to create more and more and more. And it was more about quantity over quality. And there was a lot of pressure actually on Georgian winemakers to have a production for the parameters that they were given. Like you have to make 100,000 liters. Well, wine is temperamental. I mean, it's an agricultural product. So year by year, I mean, we have vintages. You see vintages on a wine bottle for a reason, because every year is different. So there was a lot of falsification in wine, like adding sugars to kind of be able to plump up wine production. Another thing is they wanted to plant, so they had like the way that they would plant, number one, and the grape varieties that they chose. So how they would train vines and which grapes they chose were based on yield. So they wanted to plant the most high yielding vines using the rootstock that worked best for getting those results. So I've asked this question to different people over time. So I've been told a few different answers about like what was going on in Soviet period with wine. So I've been told that wine labels just had numbers on them, so people across the Soviet Union would know what they were. So they were allowed to plant 20 different grape varieties, even though Georgia has about 535.
Wow.
And this is all based on like research and science that told them what would be the best, and not necessarily even the best in terms of quality, but which were the most high yielding. You didn't see the name of a winery on there, just the name of the state monopoly, which I think was called Samtrest. I'll have to look that up actually. Um, and they were just made from the same different varieties, like 20 different varieties were allowed in these state monopoly wines. People could still make wine for home use, though. So this is how wine tradition and qvervi wine kind of was able to survive, is because there were these small people still making a little bit at home just for themselves and their family and friends. But, another thing to think about is how that impacted the soil health in Georgia. There were a lot of chemical inputs in agriculture during the Soviet period, and not just in Georgia, and not just including grapevines, just a lot of chemical inputs, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, etc. So now winemakers who are kind of wanting to make traditional wines and make terroir-driven wines are dealing with that now. It's almost like they're in recovery, right? They really have to do a lot of work in certain areas to recover soil health. I think the biggest impact is kind of killing of soil.
Yeah, I never thought about like the chemical impact to soil from Soviet occupation, and that really wasn't so long ago. That there's still, I'd imagine, a fair amount of healing and recovery that would take like generations to kind of see it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see the generational divide with people. So I'm 48. I grew up during the Cold War. I would say the majority of my friends in Georgia are around my same age. So we just have jokes like, we were thinking this about you and you were thinking this about us. Like, it's just funny. But there is a cultural divide with language, for example. So like younger people tend to speak English as their second language, whereas older Georgians will speak Russian. People who grew up during the Soviet period, they have different stories than people who maybe were born in the 90s to the 2000s. So it's just really interesting that there's a social divide, and how younger people's perception of Sovietism is different than people who actually lived through it.
Yeah.
And there's still people that romanticize it and would gladly go back to that time period. It wasn't too bad for them. I mean, they were regular people just like us, living under a certain type of political system.
Yeah, my daughter's half Polish, and so I can appreciate the nuances to that too, of having family members even within your own community, your own family, having different perspectives on like how that shapes relationships, identity, heritage as well. And in terms of thinking about the future of Georgian wine, given that there's these shifts from occupations, there's these shifts climatically, temperature changes. You also speak to the idea of wine knowledge being kind of passed down from like grandfather to father to son. Do you see the culture of wine, the different types of wine available, shifting as we're entering, an era of climate change, and an era where, you speak also to how women are getting more involved as well. So what does the future of Georgian wine look like, kind of considering all these factors coming into play?
So first, we need to go back to the 2008 Russian wine embargo, because it was very easy before that for Georgians who were making more kind of bigger wineries. Their biggest market was and still is Russia. And so they were just making, really factory industrial wines that were semi-sweet, and they would sell them to Russia. But then there was an embargo in 2008. And so that really made the wine industry have to shift because they needed to find markets to be able to sell their wine. But different markets have different tastes, and they also have different levels of like what they consider quality. So I think this is kind of the same period when you start to have the natural wine movement in Georgia. So from about 2006, you start to see some wine producers, like 4 or 5 of them, that were just sick of these gross industrial wines. They knew that Georgia had more to offer than that, because they had consumed those wines when they were younger from their fathers and grandfathers. And so they started to kind of look into making more traditional wines, using the vessels, using traditional wine grapes, for example, autochthonous wine grapes. So it's kind of tied together because it's that time that you start to see Georgian wines on an international level outside of Soviet or ex-Soviet countries, right? So they start to go to natural wine fairs in Italy and in France, for example. So, I mean, I would even say I started hearing about Georgian wine in about 2012. So I think it's important to mention that before I start talking about the future. I think the future is small production. And that's not just in Georgia. I think smaller vineyards are easier to manage for wine producers. Climate change is a huge issue across all winemaking countries, not just Georgia. I know, for example, where I live, I mean, last year, I know winemakers who lost 90 to 100% of their vines to mildew.
Oh, wow.
Just the climatic conditions were perfect for this particular mildew. They could do nothing to control it. Like, it was just so rapidly growing in their vineyards. Like the life cycle that was normally 14 days where they might have time to spray was 2 days. And also you have these problems in Georgia. Another issue it's really hard to predict how things like, are you going to get a drought this year? Or are you going to get hail? Are you going to get a frost early in areas that didn't have those problems? Now they're having these problems. So climate change is definitely not limited just to Georgia. And, Georgia is not a wealthy country. Winemakers don't necessarily have the resources to invest in things that can protect their vines from these things. Like in Chablis, they have these like wine candles that they put they're not really candles, it's like smokers. And they put them all throughout the vineyards, large vineyards, to protect the vineyards from frost. That's just not going to be possible in Georgia. Or netting to protect their vines from hail. That's not as simple. Or even access to correct rootstock that can help them with, drought or heat resistance. So I think one of the biggest issues for Georgian is probably financial.
Yeah.
I do worry. I think one thing that Georgia and Italy have in their favor is the fact that it's hilly and mountainous. So I would imagine that they're going to have to go up in elevation because vineyards just can't handle 40-degree heat for 3 months. It's really difficult, and especially if you don't get any rain. So I'm personally not positive for the entire wine industry when it comes to climate change. But it is making people wake up because their livelihoods are at stake, right? So you have a lot more producers that aren't necessarily in this natural wine movement, but they are moving towards organic. They're moving towards regenerative agriculture or biodynamic agriculture. So I think those are things that will definitely help Georgians and winemakers throughout the world is practicing those types of agriculture that kind of give back to the soil. I mean, soil health is everything. But obviously they can't control the climate. But, you start to see young people who are becoming winemakers. They're more active in terms of like what they can do for climate change. But it's really going to be up to governments. And of course, Georgia is one of the countries that's problematic. They're not the ones producing, huge amounts of greenhouse gases. In terms of women, that's a fairly modern concept of having women in wine, women making wine. It's traditionally been considered men's work. So, in the Soviet period, there were women working in the factories and there were women enologists. But it wasn't until 2012, a woman named Marina Kortinitse and her friend Thea, they made the first commercial wine from qvervi. So they were the first women that were making wine in qvervi and selling it. So Marina is Iago's husband. He's one of the most important natural wine producers in Georgia. They were very inspired when they would go to the wine fairs, for example, in Italy or in France, and they were meeting women wine producers, right? So that was what inspired them, was like going to international markets and meeting women that were making wine. I think women are very important to the future of wine in Georgia. They are extremely hardworking in Georgia. I mean, they do everything. They are the future. They are really the future. And they kind of they don't go about it in a very like alcoholic way, if that sounds correct.
Yeah.
So every year there's more and more women making wine. Sometimes it's at a very small level, but it's because of the first 2 or 3 or 4 that started making wine. They're inspiring younger women to maybe study enology. That is an option for them. To study agronomy or botany or anything that you can put into winemaking, and they consider that can actually be a career for them. And that wasn't the case even 15 years ago. Because, I mean, Marina was making her first wine in 2012. So that's 12 years ago.
Yeah, that's really not that long ago. And it's exciting to hear from you now and like the work that you document throughout your Substack newsletter, what women in wine are doing in Georgia, particularly against that backdrop that you speak of like the larger climatic changes and how industry across the world is affecting what wine is going to look like in the future. I know that's something I could talk to you about. That's like a whole other interview that we could explore as well. But I think I definitely encourage people to check out the pieces that you've covered on your newsletter where you delve into the key wine figures in Georgia as well, because that's such a nuanced perspective that you bring to that as well. In terms of where people can find you, where they can find your work, if they want to learn more about Georgian wine, do you have some resources that you'd recommend to kind of start to continue learning about it?
So there's a few ways. I do have a Substack, but it's not limited to just writing about Georgian wine. So that is sarahmaygrunwald.substack.com, but it's called contadina, which means like peasant woman in Italian. I tend to kind of intersect wine, food, agriculture, and feminism. So that's kind of the platform I use for that. My business is called Taste Georgia. So I do have some like more like Georgian wine, Georgian oriented blogs on my website, tastegeorgia.co. So it's not a .com, it's a .co. And then on Instagram, we are at Taste Georgia. So those, and I will be honest, I don't use social media anymore. But I still do have my Instagram account on there, and I'm hoping to get a younger person to maybe take it over for me so it'll be active.
It's a whole fraught area, so I definitely understand that. And I mean, your writing is just truly so layered in how you approach it. So I'm thankful that
I mean, I'm really proud of my article on Keto Ninitse. Like I've interviewed her over 5 years. So the article I wrote was kind of a culmination of like 5 years of interviewing her. And I think if you really want to like know more about specifically women and the attitudes for women in wine in Georgia, I think that article is probably the best. She even wrote a book about women in wine. She's incredible. And yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll link that in the show notes for people to check out as well, because that was such a fabulous read. But Sarah May, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure getting to learn from you, and I'm excited to keep in touch.
Thank you.
That was Sarah May Grunwald. I've linked her newsletter and Taste of Georgia media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts and help get the word out. For more Anthodish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahdugnan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Sound editing, intro music, and production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.